Get a job and stop mooching off us, my daughter in law screamed during Sunday dinner. I broke out laughing. What escaped her was my $5 million fortune. So I simply replied, "Dear darling, find yourself a new place to live." Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're here to listen. Stay here with me through this whole story and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my stories travel. My name is Ruth, and for 3 years, I've been living the most elaborate lie of my life. Not the kind of lie you tell to get out of trouble, but the kind you construct brick by brick when you need to discover who people truly are beneath their masks of politeness and family obligation. The woman who just told me to get a job, my son's wife, Wanda, has no idea she's speaking to someone who could buy her entire neighborhood without checking my bank balance. She sees a grieving widow in discount store clothing, struggling to make ends meet in a cramped apartment. She sees exactly what I've wanted her to see. For 3 years, I've played this role perfectly. The helpless mother-in-law who depends on occasional dinner invitations and birthday cards. The woman who shops at thrift stores, not by choice, but by necessity. The burden who might need financial assistance someday soon. It's been the performance of a lifetime, and Wanda just gave me the perfect exit cue. You see, when my husband Richard died, he left me with more than grief and memories. He left me with a business empire we'd built together over 25 years, real estate investments across 4 states, and enough liquid assets to live comfortably for several lifetimes. But he also left me with a question that had been eating at me since his funeral. Who would love Ruth the person, and who only tolerated Ruth the inheritance? The answer, as Wanda just demonstrated so beautifully, was more devastating than I'd imagined. My son Darren sits frozen at the other end of the table, his face cycling between shock and embarrassment. He's probably wondering if his mother has finally lost her mind. After all, we live in the house he believes his paycheck covers. We eat off the china set I supposedly couldn't afford to replace after the divorce settlement that never happened. Wanda's mouth has fallen open, her perfectly applied lipstick now a small red circle of surprise. She's trying to process what just happened, trying to figure out if I'm bluffing or if her carefully constructed world just shifted on its axis. I stand slowly, smoothing down my thrift store cardigan with hands that haven't trembled in a boardroom in decades. The same hands that signed million-dollar contracts now fold a discount napkin with deliberate precision. "Thank you for dinner," I say, my voice carrying none of the deference I've practiced for 3 years. It was exactly what I expected. The real Ruth is about to step out of the shadows, and Wanda has no idea what's coming for her. The invitation had come 3 days earlier, on a Tuesday morning when the autumn rain was turning the world gray and cold. Darren's voice carried that familiar strain it always had when Wanda was listening from somewhere nearby, probably mouthing instructions he was supposed to follow. "Mom, would you like to come for dinner this Sunday?" His words sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced them. "Wanda's making her specialty roast chicken." Her specialty. I nearly laughed into the phone. The woman could barely manage frozen dinners without burning them. But I'd learned to swallow my observations over the years. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. What time should I be there?" 6:30. "And Mom," he paused, and I could practically hear Wanda's sharp whisper cutting through whatever he'd planned to say naturally. "Maybe wear something a little nicer this time? You know how Wanda likes everything to look proper." Proper. I stared at my reflection in the hallway mirror after hanging up, gray hair pulled into a simple ponytail, no makeup, wearing the same faded sweater I'd worn to their house countless times before. For 3 years, this had been my uniform. The struggling widow, barely keeping her head above water, grateful for any crumb of attention from her successful son and his ambitious wife. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of November chill that cuts straight through thin fabric. I walked the 8 blocks to their house, the same route I'd taken dozens of times since Richard's funeral. The house looked exactly as it had when I'd purchased it for them as a wedding gift 6 years ago, though naturally they had no idea about that particular detail. The white colonial with black shutters sat pristine behind its manicured lawn, every light glowing warmly against the darkening sky. Wanda's silver SUV sat in the driveway next to Darren's sedan, both vehicles financed through loans I could have paid off with pocket change. I paused at the front door, straightening my cheap cardigan one last time. Tonight would be the end of the longest performance of my life, though Wanda didn't know it yet. The doorbell echoed inside, followed by hurried footsteps. Time for the final act. Darren opened the door with that forced smile he'd perfected over the past 3 years, bright enough to seem welcoming but thin enough to reveal the effort behind it. "Hi, Mom. Come in, come in." He stepped aside with the practiced motion of someone going through familiar motions without genuine warmth. At 32, my son had grown into a man I sometimes struggled to recognize. Still handsome, still carrying traces of the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. But there was something hollow behind his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before his marriage to Wanda. "Traffic wasn't too bad," I said, unwinding the thin scarf I'd bought specifically for these visits. Everything about my appearance was calculated, just shabby enough to reinforce their assumptions, but not so poor as to make them actually worry. "That's good." Darren helped me with my coat, his movements polite but distant. "Wanda's just finishing up in the kitchen." The house smelled like roasted chicken and something burning, probably the vegetables. Wanda insisted on preparing despite her obvious limitations in the kitchen. I followed Darren through the living room, taking in the furniture I'd helped them choose when they'd first moved in. Back then, Wanda had gushed about every piece, calling the sofa perfect and the dining set exactly what she'd always dreamed of. Now I knew better. Now I understood that her enthusiasm had lasted only until she'd decided everything in her life needed upgrading, including her husband's mother. "Can I get you something to drink?" Darren asked as we approached the dining room. "Water? Tea?" Water would be lovely. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Wanda moving with sharp, agitated gestures, muttering under her breath as she transferred food from pans to serving dishes. She was building up to something. I could feel it in the tension radiating from the kitchen. Tonight, she was finally going to say what she'd been thinking for 3 years. Darren opened the door to the dining room with an apologetic smile, gesturing toward the chair at the far end of the table. The placement wasn't accidental. It put me as far from both of them as possible, like a distant relative invited out of obligation rather than love. I took my seat without comment, noting immediately that while Darren and Wanda had matching place settings with their wedding china, mine was different. An older plate with a small chip near the rim, a water glass that didn't match the set, and a fork with a slight bend in one of the tines. Small details that spoke volumes about how I was viewed in this house. The centerpiece was elaborate. White roses arranged with obvious care, probably costing more than I supposedly spent on groceries in a week. Wanda had always been good at creating the appearance of perfection, even when everything underneath was carefully calculated. "Sorry about the delay," Wanda announced as she swept into the room carrying a platter. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, and she wore a dress that probably cost more than most people's car payments. At 29, she had the kind of aggressive beauty that demanded attention and deference, even when she'd done nothing to earn either. "No problem at all," I replied, folding my hands in my lap as she served the chicken with theatrical flourishes. "I hope you like it," she said, though her tone suggested she couldn't care less whether I did or not. "It's a family recipe, my grandmother's secret marinade." I took a bite. It was dry and overseasoned, the kind of meal that looked impressive but tasted like it had been prepared by someone more concerned with appearance than flavor. "It's delicious," I said anyway, watching Wanda's satisfied smile. The conversation that followed would change everything, though she had no idea what she was about to unleash. For 3 years, I'd been the perfect audience for her performance. Tonight, the roles were about to reverse completely. Darren cleared his throat nervously, and I could see Wanda straightening in her chair, preparing for whatever speech she'd rehearsed. The conversation limped along for the first 20 minutes like a wounded animal dragging itself across broken glass. Darren talked about his job at the consulting firm, carefully avoiding any mention of the promotion he'd been passed over for again last month. His voice carried the same defeated undertone it had developed over the past year, the sound of a man slowly accepting that his dreams might be smaller than he'd once believed. Wanda dominated most of the discussion, her voice bright and sharp as she recounted her yoga classes, her shopping expeditions, and her latest plans for home improvement. She had a way of making even mundane activities sound like major accomplishments, as if choosing new throw pillows required the same skill as negotiating international treaties. "We're thinking of redoing the entire living room," she announced, cutting her chicken into precise, tiny pieces. Something more contemporary. The furniture we have now is so dated and tired looking. I remembered helping them select that furniture when they'd first moved in. Wanda had loved every piece then, gushing about how perfect the sofa was, how the coffee table was exactly what she'd always envisioned. But that was before she decided that everything in her life needed constant upgrading to match her evolving sense of what she deserved. That sounds like it would be expensive, I said mildly, taking another bite of the overcooked chicken. Wanda's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Well, some people understand that you have to invest in quality if you want your home to reflect who you really are. Some people appreciate the value of creating a beautiful environment. The barb was crystal clear. I was neither beautiful nor quality, and certainly not worth investing in. I took a sip of water from my mismatched glass and said nothing, letting her words hang in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. Actually, Mom, Darren began, and I could hear the reluctance thick in his voice. We wanted to talk to you about something tonight. I set down my fork and waited, though I already knew what was coming. Wanda leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting into what she probably thought looked like genuine concern but came across more like a predator preparing to strike. The moment I'd been waiting 3 years for was finally arriving. All those careful months of playing the struggling widow, all those thrift store cardigans and deliberately modest meals, all those times I'd bitten my tongue when Wanda made her cutting little comments, it was all about to pay off. Because tonight, Wanda was going to show me exactly who she really was. Ruth, we've been worried about you, Wanda began, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable while delivering a blow. Living alone in that tiny apartment, struggling to make ends meet. It's been 3 years since Richard passed, and you're still not really getting back on your feet. I'm managing just fine, I said quietly, though I could feel the trap closing around the conversation. Are you, though? Wanda's smile was all sharp edges and false sympathy. You can barely afford your rent. You shop at thrift stores for everything. You don't even have a car anymore. And frankly, it's starting to affect Darren. All true, from their perspective. What they didn't know was that every single choice had been deliberate. The small apartment was paid for in cash. The thrift store clothes were a carefully constructed costume. The lack of a car was because I preferred to walk and take taxis, not because I couldn't afford a fleet of vehicles. I get by, I replied. Getting by isn't living, Mom, Darren said, and for a moment I heard genuine concern in his voice. It gave me a flicker of hope that somewhere underneath Wanda's influence, my real son still existed. But then Wanda took control again, like she always did. The thing is, Ruth, we can't keep helping you forever. Her voice carried the weight of someone making a difficult but necessary decision. Darren works incredibly hard for his money, and we have our own future to think about. We want to start a family soon, and we need to be practical about our finances. I looked at Darren, waiting for him to contradict her, to remind her that their help consisted of occasional dinners and birthday cards with $20 tucked inside. He said nothing, just stared at his plate like it contained the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Wanda continued, emboldened by his silence. What we're trying to say is, maybe it's time you thought about getting a job. You're only 62. Lots of people your age work. Target is always hiring greeters. Or maybe you could do something part-time at a grocery store. The suggestion hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Target greeter. After running a successful consulting business for 20 years alongside Richard, after building the fortune that could buy and sell their entire neighborhood 3 times over, she wanted me to stand at Target saying hello to strangers for minimum wage. A job, I repeated slowly, letting the word roll around in my mouth like I was tasting something bitter. Yes. Wanda's eyes lit up like she'd just solved world hunger. Something to give you purpose. You know, independence. Self-respect. Self-respect. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with the bent fork she'd given me. I felt something cold and dangerous settle in my chest. I've been thinking about your situation a lot lately, Wanda continued, clearly pleased with herself for what she imagined was her generous concern. And I realized what the real problem is. You've gotten too comfortable being dependent on others, on Darren. It's not healthy for any of us. I felt that cold sensation spreading through my chest. Not anger exactly, but something far calmer and infinitely more dangerous. Is that what you think I am? Dependent? Wanda glanced at Darren, seeking backup that he wasn't prepared to give. Well, let's be honest here. You rely on us for everything. Every time there's a bill you can't pay, every time something breaks in your apartment, who do you call? The answer was no one. I hadn't asked them for a single penny since Richard's funeral. But apparently, in Wanda's carefully constructed narrative, my very existence was a burden that weighed on their generous hearts. I see, I said softly. Don't take it personally, Wanda continued, warming to her theme like an actress hitting her stride. It's just that Darren and I are trying to build something here. We're young, we're ambitious, and we can't be constantly worried about supporting someone who won't even try to support herself. Won't even try. The words echoed in my mind as I looked at this woman who'd never worked a day in her life, who spent Darren's paycheck on designer handbags and spa treatments, who lived in a house she didn't know I owned while lecturing me about self-sufficiency. I set down my water glass with deliberate care. Wanda, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes? I looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, I let her see something real. Something that made her lean back slightly in her chair, some instinct warning her that the dynamic in the room had just shifted in a way she didn't understand. You have absolutely no idea what's coming for you. The silence that followed was deafening. Darren shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Wanda's perfectly lipsticked mouth opened and closed like a fish suddenly finding itself out of water. Excuse me? She finally managed. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. Thank you for dinner. The chicken was exactly what I expected. I walked to the front door, my footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the house like a heavy blanket. Behind me, I could hear Wanda's sharp whisper cutting through the silence. Did she just threaten me? At the door, I turned back to see both of them staring at me from the dining room doorway. Darren looked confused and slightly worried, like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Wanda looked rattled, her carefully composed mask slipping just enough to reveal the uncertainty underneath. Oh, and Wanda, I said, my hand resting on the doorknob. About that job advice you gave me. What about it? Her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I smiled, and I made sure it wasn't a warm expression. You might want to start updating your own resume. 4 days passed before Darren called. I'd been expecting it, of course. Wanda wouldn't have let him rest until he'd gotten some answers about my bizarre behavior at their dinner table. I was sitting in my small apartment by the window with my morning coffee when the phone rang. The expensive coffee I kept hidden in the back of my cupboard, the kind that cost more per pound than Wanda spent on groceries in a week. Mom, his voice was cautious, like he was speaking to someone who might be unstable. Can we talk? Of course, sweetheart. Would you like to come over? There was a pause. In 3 years, Darren had never once visited my apartment. He'd offered to help me move in, but I'd declined. He'd suggested stopping by for coffee, but there was always some excuse from Wanda about why that wouldn't work out. Now, faced with the possibility of actually seeing how his mother lived, he sounded uncertain. Yes, okay, I'll be there in an hour. I spent the next 60 minutes preparing for the most important conversation I'd had with my son in years. I made his favorite coffee and put away the financial documents I'd been reviewing. I changed from my usual thrift store cardigan into something slightly nicer, though still carefully modest. When he arrived, Darren looked around the small apartment with barely concealed pity. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, furniture that looked like it had come from estate sales, which technically some of it had, though I'd bought it specifically to create this impression rather than out of necessity. Mom, this place is. He struggled for words. Small, I suggested. I was going to say depressing. I poured him coffee in one of my good cups. Another little luxury I kept hidden from view most of the time. He took a sip and looked surprised. This is really good coffee. I splurge occasionally. We sat across from each other at my small kitchen table. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and I could see him gathering his courage for whatever conversation Wanda had sent him here to have. Finally, Darren cleared his throat. About Sunday night. Yes? Wanda's really upset. She thinks you threatened her. I met his eyes steadily. What do you think? He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with being asked to form his own opinion. I think, I think something's going on with you that I don't understand. You've been different lately, Darren continued, running his hands through his hair the way he used to do as a child when he was nervous. Distant. And then Sunday night, the way you looked at Wanda, the things you said. It was like you were a completely different person. I took a sip of my coffee, considering my words carefully. The time for complete honesty hadn't arrived yet, but I could offer him a glimpse behind the curtain I'd been maintaining for 3 years. Darren, do you remember what your father used to say about people who mistake kindness for weakness? He frowned, thinking. He said they usually learn the difference eventually, but by then it's too late to matter. Exactly. I set down my cup and leaned forward slightly. For 3 years, I've been kind, patient. I've watched your wife treat me like a burden, an embarrassment, a problem to be solved. I've listened to her suggestions about how I should live my life, what I should do with my time, how I should dress, where I should work. Darren looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair. She's just trying to help, Mom. Is she? Or is she trying to make me disappear in the most socially acceptable way possible? Mom, that's not. Let me ask you something. I leaned forward, watching his face carefully. When was the last time Wanda asked me how I was doing? Not how I was managing financially, not whether I needed help with bills, but how I was actually doing as a person grieving the loss of her husband. He opened his mouth, then closed it, unable to find an answer. When was the last time she asked about my interests, my friends, what I do with my days beyond struggling to pay rent? When was the last time she treated me like a human being instead of an inconvenience? Darren stared into his coffee cup, and I could see the wheels turning as he tried to remember a single instance of genuine warmth from his wife toward me. She's not. He began, then stopped. She's not what? She doesn't mean to be cold. Doesn't she? I stood up and walked to the small bookshelf in my living room. Hidden behind a row of paperback novels was a manila folder, one I'd been keeping for exactly this moment. I pulled it out and returned to the table. Darren, I said, opening the folder carefully, there's something I need to tell you about your mother. What? Inside the folder were bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, documents I'd kept hidden for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. His eyes widened as he began to process what he was seeing. Mom, what is this? This is who I really am. I watched his face as he flipped through page after page, account balances that showed figures he'd never imagined his mother possessing. Investment portfolios worth millions, property deeds for houses, commercial buildings, parcels of land across 3 states. I don't understand, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Your father and I were very successful, Darren, more successful than we ever let on. When he died, I inherited everything. I'm worth approximately $5 million. Darren stared at me like I'd just told him I was an alien from another planet. The coffee cup trembled slightly in his hands as he set it down. But you live here. In this apartment, you shop at thrift stores. You don't even have a car. By choice. Why? The word came out strangled, barely audible. I closed the folder and looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved, and watched slowly disappear under his wife's influence over the past 3 years, because I needed to know who would love me when they thought I had nothing. The words hit him like a physical blow. I watched the realization dawn in his eyes, watched him understand what the last 3 years had really been about. You've been testing us. I've been protecting myself. From what? From people like your wife. Darren's hands were shaking now as he pushed the folder away from him. Mom, this is insane. You let us think you were struggling. You let Wanda think. I let Wanda show me exactly who she is, I interrupted, keeping my voice calm and matter of fact. And she did, repeatedly. For 3 years. But I'm your son. Yes, you are. And I needed to know if you were still my son or if you'd become something else entirely. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's not fair. Isn't it? When was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you invited me somewhere without Wanda insisting on it? When was the last time you stood up for me when she was being cruel? Each question was a knife, and I could see them finding their marks. Darren's face crumpled as he processed not just my deception, but his own complicity in his wife's treatment of me. I didn't realize she was being that bad. Or you chose not to see it because it was easier. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 3 years of careful lies settling between us like dust after an explosion. Finally, Darren spoke, his voice barely audible. What happens now? I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. My son, who'd inherited his father's gentle nature, at least until he'd married Wanda. Now, I said softly, we find out if it's too late for you to remember who you used to be. And Wanda? Darren asked, though from his expression, I could tell he already suspected the answer wouldn't be pleasant. I smiled, and I knew it wasn't a kind expression. Wanda is about to discover that some people aren't as helpless as they appear. Mom, what are you planning? Justice, I said simply. Long overdue justice. Darren stood up abruptly, pacing to the window like a caged animal. This is crazy. You can't just, what? Punish her for 3 years of marriage problems? 3 years of calculated cruelty, I corrected. 3 years of treating me like dirt while living off your income, which comes from a job you only have because of the connections your father and I built over 20 years. That stopped him cold. He turned from the window, his face pale. What? Did you think that consulting position just fell into your lap? Your father called in favors to get you that interview. We've been pulling strings behind the scenes your entire adult life, making sure you had opportunities, opening doors that would have stayed closed otherwise. His face went ashen. How much of my life has been a lie? None of it was a lie, sweetheart, but some of it was protected. I stood and walked to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. I love you, Darren. I've loved you since before you were born. But love doesn't mean accepting abuse, not even from family. He turned to face me, and for a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be, the one who brought me wildflowers and told me I was the prettiest mommy in the world. What do I do? That's up to you. But I want you to think about something. What? In 3 years of marriage, has Wanda ever once encouraged you to spend time with me? Has she ever suggested that maybe, just maybe, I might have value beyond what I could provide financially? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of obvious truth. That's what I thought. I squeezed his arm gently. Some storms are coming, sweetheart. When they hit, you'll have to decide which side of them you want to be on. Is that a threat? It's a promise, I said, and unlike some people in your life, I always keep my promises. I gave them a week to process what I'd told Darren. A week for him to go home, look at his wife with new eyes, and decide what kind of man he wanted to be. A week for Wanda to wonder what exactly I'd meant by my parting words at their dinner table. The call came on a Wednesday morning, exactly 7 days later. Wanda's voice, sharp and demanding, cut through the peaceful quiet of my apartment like a blade through silk. Ruth, we need to talk, right now. Good morning to you too, Wanda. Don't play games with me. Darren told me about your little revelation. About the money. I smiled, settling into my favorite chair with my coffee, the expensive blend that cost more per pound than she spent on her weekly manicures. Did he? Yes, he did. And I want to know what kind of sick game you've been playing. What kind of game do you think I've been playing? Her voice rose an octave, losing the controlled tone she usually maintained. You let us think you were poor. You sat there and let me worry about you. Let me try to help you. And all this time you were secretly rich. Let her worry about me. Let her try to help. The revisionist history was breathtaking, even for Wanda. I see. And how exactly did you help me, dear? Silence. Then, we invited you to dinner. We included you in family events. You mean the dinners where you served me on mismatched plates and lectured me about getting a job at Target? More silence? You're coming over tonight, she finally declared. We're settling this. Am I? Yes, 7 o'clock, and Ruth, you owe us an explanation. The line went dead. I set the phone down and finished my coffee, thinking about the conversation that lay ahead. Then I walked to my bedroom closet and pushed aside the thrift store cardigans and discount dresses. In the back, wrapped in protective garment bags, hung the clothes I used to wear, the clothes that reflected who I really was. I selected a black dress, elegant but not flashy, real jewelry, not the costume pieces I'd been wearing, shoes that cost more than Wanda spent on groceries in a month. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who could buy and sell everything Wanda had ever owned without checking her bank balance. It was time to stop hiding. I arrived at their house at exactly 7 o'clock. The same house I'd purchased for them 6 years ago, though they'd never known it. The same house whose mortgage I'd been quietly paying through a property management company, letting them believe Darren's salary covered the payments. Darren answered the door, and his eyes widened when he saw me. "Mom, you look different." "Like myself," I said quietly. "Like I used to look when your father was alive." Wanda appeared behind him, and her expression was pure venom. She'd dressed for battle too, in a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. But next to the quiet confidence of real wealth, her attempts at intimidation looked like a child playing dress up. Well, she said, looking me up and down with obvious disdain. "The poor widow has quite the wardrobe hidden away." "Among other things," I replied mildly. We moved to the living room, the same room I'd helped them furnish when they'd first moved in. I took a seat on the sofa I'd helped them pick out, in the house I'd bought, surrounded by the life I'd made possible for them. "Okay," Wanda said, positioning herself like a prosecutor about to deliver closing arguments. "Let's hear it. The whole truth. What would you like to know?" "Everything. How much money do you have? Why did you lie to us? What kind of person pretends to be poor for 3 years?" I folded my hands in my lap and looked at her calmly. "The kind of person who wants to know who her real friends are." "Friends?" Wanda's laugh was sharp and brittle. "I'm your daughter-in-law, not your friend. Family doesn't lie to family." "Wanda's, doesn't it? Then perhaps you'd like to explain why you told the neighbors I was becoming senile." Wanda's face went pale. Darren turned to stare at her, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching horror. "I never said that," she stammered. "You told Mrs. Henderson that I was showing signs of dementia. You suggested to the mailman that I might need to be placed in a care facility soon. You've been building a narrative about my declining mental state for months." That's not true," Wanda said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Or not something you expected me to find out about," I said softly. Darren's voice was barely a whisper. "Wanda, is that true?" She spun toward him, eyes blazing. I was concerned. She was acting strange, saying weird things, dressing like a bag lady. I thought she might be losing it. "Or," I said quietly, "you were laying groundwork for having me declared incompetent so you could access what you thought was Richard's life insurance money." The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Wanda's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "That's insane," she finally managed. "Why would I do that?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "Because 3 months ago, you contacted an elder law attorney. You inquired about the process for obtaining guardianship over an elderly relative who was showing signs of mental decline." Darren shot to his feet. "What?" I opened the envelope and pulled out printed emails, phone records, consultation notes. "You wanted to know how quickly the process could be completed and whether there were ways to expedite it if the relative had significant assets. How did you get those?" Wanda's voice was barely audible. "Money opens many doors, dear, including the ones you thought were locked." Darren was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. "Wanda, please tell me this isn't true." "It's not what it looks like," she said desperately. "I was just worried about her. I wanted to know what options we had if she really was getting sick." "Funny thing about that," I continued, "the attorney's notes indicate you were particularly interested in whether guardianship would give you access to bank accounts and investment portfolios. You specifically asked about liquidating assets for the patient's own good." The color drained from Wanda's face completely. She sank into a chair, her hands shaking. "Mom," Darren said, his voice hollow, "please tell me you're making this up." "I'm afraid not, sweetheart." "But why? Why would she do this?" I looked at Wanda, who was staring at the floor, and felt something that might have been pity if she'd deserved it. "Because she never loved you, Darren. She loved what she thought you could provide." And when it became clear that your salary alone wasn't enough to fund the lifestyle she wanted, she started looking for other sources of income. That's not true, Wanda whispered, but the words came out weak and hollow. Isn't it? Then explain the credit card debt you've been hiding from your husband, the shopping sprees you've been financing with cash advances, the jewelry you've been pawning and replacing with fakes. Darren's face went white. What? I pulled out another set of documents. Your wife has been living beyond your means for 2 years. She owes $47,000 on cards you don't know about. Wanda, is this true? She finally looked up, and her face was streaked with tears. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage at being caught. You, she hissed at me, you vindictive, manipulative witch. You set me up. I didn't set you up, dear. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. She stood up, swaying slightly. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've won? Congratulations. You wanted to destroy my marriage, and you did it. I stood as well, and suddenly the small apartment version of myself was gone completely. In her place stood the woman who'd built a business empire alongside her husband, who'd made million-dollar decisions without blinking, who'd never backed down from a fight in her life. I didn't destroy your marriage, Wanda. You did. The moment you decided that my son was just a stepping stone to something better. I love Darren. You love what Darren represents: security, status, a meal ticket. But you've never loved him. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Reveal what you really are? I walked closer to her, close enough that she had to look up to meet my eyes. You want to know what's really going to happen here, Wanda? What? You're going to pack your things, and you're going to leave this house tonight. She laughed, high and wild. You can't make me leave my own home. Actually, I can. I pulled out one more document from my purse. The deed to the house, with my name clearly visible as the owner. This house belongs to me. It always has. You and Darren have been living here as my guests for 6 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Darren stared at the deed like it was written in a foreign language. Mom, what does this mean? It means your wife has 30 minutes to pack a bag and get out of my house. Wanda was shaking now, fury and fear warring in her expression. You can't do this. I have rights. Tenant rights. You're not a tenant. You're a guest who's overstayed her welcome. I folded the deed and put it away. 30 minutes, Wanda. After that, I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. Darren! She turned to him desperately. Say something. This is our home. But Darren was still staring at the spot where the deed had been, processing the full scope of what he'd just learned. His entire adult life, built on foundations he'd never understood. Darren, she screamed. He looked up at her, and his expression was that of a man seeing clearly for the first time in years. Get out, he said quietly. What? Get out of my mother's house. Wanda's face crumpled, but I felt no satisfaction in her tears. Only tired relief that the charade was finally over. This isn't over, she said, looking at me with pure hatred. You think you've won, but this isn't over. I smiled, and I made sure she could see exactly how little her threats meant to me. Oh, but it is, dear. This is just the beginning of what happens to people who mistake my kindness for weakness. She ran from the room, her footsteps pounding up the stairs. I could hear her throwing things around, slamming drawers, sobbing with rage. Darren and I stood in the living room, surrounded by the wreckage of his marriage and the echoes of 3 years of lies finally exposed to the light. Mom, he said finally. Yes, I'm sorry. I know you are, sweetheart. What happens now? I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street, thinking about second chances and the price of forgiveness. Now we find out if it's possible to rebuild what we lost. The calls started the next morning. First, my sister-in-law Margaret, Richard's brother's wife, her voice tight with disapproval. Ruth, what in God's name has gotten into you? Wanda called me crying last night. She says you threw her out of her own home. I was sitting in my small apartment, still maintaining the charade for now, sipping coffee from my chipped mug while listening to Margaret's outrage. Did she mention why? I asked mildly. She said you've been lying about money. pretending to be poor when you're actually wealthy. Ruth, that's disturbed behavior. Margaret, did Wanda happen to mention the attorney she consulted about having me declared incompetent? Or the $47,000 in secret debt she's accumulated? Silence. Ask her when you're done feeling sorry for her. I hung up before she could respond. By noon, I'd received calls from 6 relatives, all parroting the same narrative. Poor Wanda, innocent victim of a vindictive mother-in-law who'd lost her mind with grief. The most disturbing call came from my nephew Marcus, Margaret's son, whom I'd helped put through college just 5 years earlier. Aunt Ruth, he said, his voice careful and professional. The family is concerned that you might be showing signs of dementia or some other cognitive decline. I set down my coffee cup very carefully. Marcus, let me ask you something. Do you remember who paid for your final year at Northwestern? Mom and Dad helped and I had loans. Your parents contributed $8,000. I paid the remaining $34,000. I also paid for your sister's wedding, your mother's breast cancer treatment that insurance didn't cover, and the down payment on your first house. Silence. So when you talk about my cognitive decline, you might want to consider whether someone with dementia would remember those details quite so clearly. He hung up without another word. Wanda hadn't just disappeared quietly into the night. She'd launched a campaign, painting herself as the victim of an unstable older woman who'd suddenly snapped. 2 days later, Darren called. His voice was strained, exhausted. Mom, can we meet? We need to talk. Wanda's been calling everyone. The family's in an uproar. We met at a small cafe downtown. Darren looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes wrinkled. She's destroyed everything, he said without preamble. She's not just telling everyone her version of what happened. She's making things up. She told my boss that you're suffering from dementia and that I've been distracted at work, worried about your mental health. She suggested they might want to consider whether my job performance has been affected. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. What did your boss say? He was sympathetic, suggested I might want to look into family medical leave. There's something else you should know, I said gently. Wanda filed a false police report yesterday, claiming elder abuse. She's going to be arrested. Darren's face went pale. Mom, what did you do? I told the truth. All of it. The police have seen the evidence of her attempted fraud, her lies, her manipulation. Justice, sweetheart. Just like I promised. We sat in silence for a moment, processing the end of Wanda's reign of terror. What happens now? Darren asked finally. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and protected and almost lost to someone who'd never deserved him. Now we rebuild. Honestly, this time, no more tests, no more games, no more lies. Can we really start over? That depends on whether you can forgive yourself for not seeing who she really was and whether you can forgive me for the test I put you through. Darren looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the boy he used to be before Wanda had gotten her claws into him. No more tests? No more tests, I agreed. But sweetheart, if you ever bring home another woman like Wanda, I'm moving to Europe and not leaving a forwarding address. For the first time in months, my son laughed. Really laughed. Deal, he said. Definitely deal. 3 months later, Wanda was sentenced to 6 months in jail and 2 years probation. Darren filed for divorce the same week, and I finally moved out of my little apartment and back into the penthouse where I belonged. The woman who had spent 3 years testing everyone around her was finally ready to trust again, and the son who had nearly lost himself to a predator was free to become the man he was always meant to be. Some tests are worth taking, even when they cost you everything, especially when they give you back what matters most. Now I'm curious about you. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever gone through something like this? Let me know in the comments. And while you're here, I've left 2 of my other stories on screen. I promise they'll surprise you. Thanks for watching all the way to the end.